The desert wind cut across the camp with a dry, whistling sound, carrying with it the sting of sand and the taste of dust. The Navy SEAL team had been deployed for 3 days, lying low in the ruins of an abandoned village carved out of sunburnt stone. Their mission was critical, intelligence that couldn't wait. An arms convoy loaded with enough weapons to destabilize the region was moving toward the border under the protection of heavily armed insurgents. The SEALs were good, trained for moments like this, but even they knew they were stretched thin. Their sniper, the one man they depended on to control the high ground, had been taken out of action the night before. An IED strike had rattled the convoy, shrapnel tearing across his scope eye. He was stable but useless for the rifle. That left the team without eyes, with Then there was her, quiet, sharp-eyed, sitting near the fire as though she had always belonged, though in truth she was never meant to be here. Her name was Lena, though in the unit's silence they rarely called her that. She had come into their orbit as an interpreter, a liaison meant to handle negotiations with locals when force wasn't the solution. Nobody expected much beyond her steady voice, her clean translations, and the calm way she navigated tense conversations. But there was more in her than the men had ever understood. She listened to them the way someone studies a puzzle, her eyes lingering when they checked weapons, her hands mimicking their motions in secret, and though she spoke little of her past, every line of her posture hinted at someone who had lived close to violence. When the sniper went down, Lena who asked the question that made every man glance at her in disbelief. "What about the rifle?" she said. "Who will cover you?" It wasn't bravado, not even arrogance. It was a statement of fact. The SEALs exchanged wary glances, the kind that passed entire conversations without words. They knew what the rifle meant, the responsibility of it, the patience, the burden of pulling a trigger that could save. It wasn't a role anyone could just step into, but Lena did not flinch under their doubt. Instead, she walked toward the weapon, her hands brushing the stock with a familiarity no one had taught her here. The team leader, Mason, narrowed his eyes. "You think you can run that thing?" His tone was half incredulous, half warning. Lena looked back at him, and though her voice was quiet, it carried with the weight of unshakable certainty. "I don't think." "I know." Mason was not a man easily convinced, but time was against them. The convoy was already on the move, and without cover, their operation was suicide. He gestured at the rifle. "Show me." Lena sank into the dirt like she belonged there, her body aligning with the weapon, cheek resting against the stock, finger brushing the trigger guard but never rushing. She adjusted the scope with the smooth, unhurried rhythm of someone who had done this before. Through the lens, the world narrowed to a tunnel, every detail sharpened. The shimmer of heat, the distance markers, the faint trail of dust in the horizon that meant vehicles were approaching. She steadied her breathing, blocking out the noise of the men behind her. The rifle was no stranger. It was an extension of her, a whisper from a life she had buried but never forgotten. When she fired at a stone marker more than 800 yards away, the bullet cracked the silence and the target shattered in perfect precision. No hesitation, no correction. Just truth. The silence that followed was heavier than the shot itself. The SEALs exchanged looks, and for once their disbelief bent into something closer to respect. Mason crouched beside her, studying the line of her shoulders, the calmness in her eyes. He didn't ask where she learned it, didn't care for her past in that moment. What mattered was now, and now she was the only chance they had. He gave a short nod. "All right, you've got Overwatch." His voice carried authority, but beneath it was something else, the faint admission that even hardened men knew when fate handed them a weapon in an unexpected shape. The hours crawled by, the sun sinking lower as the convoy approached. The SEALs moved into position, their bodies ghosts among the ruins, weapons ready but trust resting on Lena's scope. The rumble of engines echoed first, then the sharp clatter of armed men shouting commands. Dust rose in thick clouds as trucks rolled into view, their beds loaded with crates marked in faded stencils. The insurgents moved with confidence, believing the desert belonged to them, never knowing death watched from the shadows. Lena's heartbeat slowed as she tracked them, her finger feathering the trigger, every target mapped in her mind. She wasn't reckless. She waited, patient, the way she had once been taught. Fractured. The call came through Mason's mic, "Take the shot." The first man never knew what hit him. He was standing atop a truck, rifle slung across his chest, shouting orders when Lena's bullet punched through his chest and dropped him like a puppet with cut strings. Panic followed. The convoy scattered, men rushing for cover, shouting in confusion as more shots cracked the air. Lena's calm never faltered. Each breath was a rhythm, each squeeze of the trigger a clean punctuation. One shot, one kill. A gunner climbed to a mounted machine gun. Her bullet shattered his skull before his hands reached the grip. Another tried to drag a crate for cover. She clipped him in the shoulder, spinning him into the dust where he bled out seconds later. The SEALs advanced, a storm beneath her precision. Every time an enemy flanked, Lena cut them down. Every time she split them apart. Her wrath was not loud, not screaming, it was cold, efficient, unrelenting. And in the middle of that chaos, the men who had doubted her began to understand. They moved with the certainty that someone unseen was guarding them, someone who could see farther, strike sharper, and who would not miss. She had become the thing they had lost, and more than that, something new, the fury of a past they still didn't know wielded in their defense. When the last shot echoed into silence, the desert was still again. Smoke rose from the wreckage, bodies lay broken in the dust, and the SEALs emerged victorious, not one casualty among them. Mason looked back at Lena, still prone behind the rifle, her face unreadable, her eyes fixed on the horizon as though waiting for something more. He exhaled slowly, a rare, almost reverent smile tugging at his mouth. "We'll remember this," he said softly, voice meant for his men but his eyes never leaving her. "We'll remember her wrath." Night settled over the desert with a chill that bit deeper than the sun's heat had burned hours before. The convoy lay in ruins, smoke drifting lazily toward the stars, and the silence after battle was heavier than gunfire. The SEALs regrouped among the broken vehicles, checking ammunition, whispering to command through their radios, but the air was different now. Their eyes flicked to Lena not as an interpreter or a civilian, but as something else entirely, someone who had revealed a weapon in herself no one had expected. She sat quietly near the rifle, still and composed, her gaze distant as if her mind was not here at all but walking the ghosts of another life. Mason approached, crouching beside her in the glow of a dying fire. "That was no accident," he said. "You've done this behind her eyes." "A long time ago," she answered, voice even. Mason studied her for a beat longer, then nodded. He didn't press. Soldiers knew when someone carried scars that didn't need reopening. But the team had questions, each of them burning with the image of her steady hands and perfect aim. They respected silence, yet curiosity lingered. One of them, Reyes, broke it with a smirk. "Hell of a shot for an interpreter. You planning on putting that on your resume?" The others chuckled, but Lena didn't smile. She only replied, "You don't forget what saves your life." The words were soft, but they cut through the night like a blade, and even the laughter faded. Orders came through before dawn. Their mission wasn't over. The destroyed convoy was only part of a chain. Intelligence confirmed that another shipment, larger and more heavy, came 2 days east. It was the final link, and if it broke through, the enemy would flood the region with weapons that could keep the war burning for years. Command authorized the SEAL team to intercept, but resources were tight. Extraction wasn't an option. They would move on foot, blend with the terrain, and strike when the enemy least expected it. Mason relayed the orders, and every man prepared in silence. Lena said nothing, but when Mason glanced at her, he saw no hesitation in her face. She had chosen her place among them, and none of the men questioned it now. The march was brutal. The desert offered no mercy, scorching sun by day, freezing wind by night, sand clawing at their throats and searing their eyes. But Lena endured it with the same unflinching steadiness she showed behind the scope. She carried her share of gear, kept pace without complaint, and when the men rested, she cleaned the rifle with meticulous care. It wasn't theirs anymore, it was hers, claimed by the way she touched it, the way she handled it like a limb returned to her body. At night, when the fire dimmed low, the SEALs whispered in their circle. "Where the hell you think she learned that?" one asked. "Not the army, not the Corps," another replied. "Could be foreign military," Reyes guessed. Mason listened but offered nothing. He didn't need answers. He had seen the look in her eyes when she took her first shot. That wasn't training. That was survival. 2 days later they reached the canyon. Sheer walls rose like jagged teeth, the path narrow and treacherous. It was the perfect choke point for an ambush, and also the perfect place to die if the enemy had scouts ahead. The SEALs moved carefully, eyes sharp, but it was Lena who froze first, her hand lifting in a silent command that startled her belly, scope glinting as she scanned the rocks. "Sniper," she whispered. Mason blinked. He hadn't seen it. Neither had the others. But Lena guided their eyes, pointing out the faint shimmer of glass, the unnatural shape among stone. She fired before Mason even gave the order, the shot cracking through the canyon. A body tumbled from the high ridge, limbs snapping against rock, and the echo of his scream was swallowed by silence. The men stared at her with something beyond respect now. Gratitude, maybe even awe. She had just saved them from walking into a slaughter. Mason's voice came low, firm. "We follow her lead." No one argued. They shifted formation, trusting her scope as their eyes. Lena became the silent guardian, watching angles they could not, guiding them through the canyon like she had walked it in another life. And the men began to feel something they hadn't felt in days: safety, a fragile shield forged by her presence. By nightfall they had eyes on the second convoy. This one was monstrous compared to the first. Armored trucks, mounted machine guns, and nearly twice the manpower. The insurgents had learned from the last ambush. They were alert, their guns sweeping the ridges, voices barking into radios. Mason knew this wouldn't be simple. He gathered the men, laying out the plan in low tones. They would hit hard and fast, take out the gunners first, then collapse the convoy before it reached the bend in the canyon where reinforcements could close in. Timing was everything. Precision was survival. He looked to Lena last, not as an outsider but as part of the team. "You think you can keep them blind long enough for us to cut through?" Lena chambered around, her face cold steel. "You move," she said. "I'll make sure you get there." The attack began with her wrath. The first gunner toppled backward before his finger touched the trigger. The second dropped with his eyes still searching the ridges. The third tried to shout a warning, but Lena's bullet silenced him mid-breath. Each shot carved open a gap in the enemy's defense, and the SEALs surged forward like a blade through soft flesh. Bullets tore the air, grenades cracked against metal, screams ricocheted in the canyon, but through it all Lena's scope was merciless. She cut down flanks, shattered ambushes before they began, and in the roar of chaos, the men moved with the confidence of knowing every hidden threat would fall before it reached them. The convoy broke under their fury. Trucks caught fire, munitions detonated in violent blossoms of flame, and the canyon filled with the thunder of destruction. When the last vehicle against numbers that should have crushed them, they had not lost a man. As they pulled back into the safety of the rocks, Reyes slapped Lena's shoulder with a grin fierce enough to mask his trembling hands. "Remind me never to get on your bad side." She gave no reply, only reloaded her rifle with the same quiet resolve. And when the echoes of battle faded into the night, the men found themselves repeating the same words Mason had spoken before, as if it were the only explanation for what they had witnessed. "We'll remember her wrath." The canyon smelled of smoke and cordite long after the fires burned low. The team huddled in the shadows of a rock outcrop, nursing bruises, checking wounds, and rationing water. They had won, but victory came at a cost. Their bodies ached, ammunition was running thin, and exhaustion clung to them like the sand in their boots. Yet the most precious was Lena. She had transformed the battle, guided them through death's teeth and back out again, and now, every man who once doubted her treated her with a reverence that went unsaid but was heavy in the air. Mason leaned against a boulder, helmet tilted back, eyes on the stars, but his thoughts kept circling back to her. She hadn't celebrated, hadn't spoken a word after the firefight. She simply sat with the rifle on her lap, cleaning it with mechanical precision, her face unreadable. Mason recognized that look. He'd seen it in combat veterans who'd fought too many battles to remember. Hours later, when the others had dozed off, Mason found her still awake, gaze fixed on the black horizon. "You should rest," he told her quietly. Lena shook her head. "Where the hell did you learn to shoot like that?" She didn't answer right away. The wind filled the silence between them, whistling through broken stone. Finally she whispered, "There are wars people don't talk about. Wars fought in alleys, rooftops, and nameless villages. You either learn to see farther than your enemy or you die. I learned." Her eyes flicked toward him then, sharp and hard as steel. "And I didn't die." Mason let the silence linger, then nodded once. He didn't ask more. Soldiers learned quickly that everyone carried ghosts, and dragging them out into the open only made them bleed again. Still, as he walked away, he knew something vital. Lena wasn't filling in as their sniper. She was one. She had always been one long before their mission. And now she was theirs. The next morning, command's orders crackled through broken comms. The convoy ambush was a success, but surveillance drones picked up chatter. An enemy stronghold sat deeper in the desert, a fortress carved into an old mining complex. It was here the insurgents stockpiled weapons, trained recruits, and staged operations. Destroying it would cripple their reach for months. The SEALs weren't supposed to take on targets this large without full support, but no support was coming. Command gave them the option: retreat or finish what they started. Mason gathered the men, dust and sweat crusted on their faces. If we walk away, more convoys come, more weapons flow, and more blood gets spilled. We take it out now, we end this here. His eyes moved to Lena. With her we have a chance. Nobody disagreed. The march to the mining complex tested them harder than anything before. Days under an unforgiving sun, nights cold, rationed, every step heavy with fatigue. Yet Lena never faltered. When men stumbled, she steadied them. When spirits wavered, her silence alone seemed to steel them. And always, the rifle was near her hands as if it had fused to her. They began to move as if she had always been one of them, as if she belonged in their formation, their guardian on the ridges. On the fourth day they reached the fortress. Dug into the earth, ringed with guard towers, lit by searchlights that swept across the barren landscape, it was a fortress of shadows and steel. Insurgents patrolled the perimeter with rifles slung, laughing and smoking, unaware that death crouched in the rocks beyond. The SEALs set up on the ridge, scanning the stronghold. There were too many guards, too many fortified positions. A direct assault would be suicide. They needed chaos and the strike of a sniper who could peel the defenses apart. Mason turned to Lena. "Can you thread this needle?" She adjusted the scope, eyes narrowing as she mapped the towers, the patrol routes, the weak seams in the enemy's armor. "I'll open the door," she said. The operation began at twilight. Lena's first shot cracked through the dusk, punching through the throat of a guard on the highest tower. Before his body hit the ground, she shifted, firing again. Another guard collapsed over the railing, rifle clattering into the sand. The men below scrambled in panic, shouting in confusion as searchlights swiveled wildly. Lena was calm, every breath a rhythm, every trigger squeeze another fracture in the fortress's defense. She dropped a radio operator before he could call for backup, shattered a spotlight before it swept across Mason's men, and carved a path for the SEALs to slip closer under the chaos. Inside the fortress walls, the battle exploded. The SEALs moved like shadows, clearing buildings with brutal efficiency. Gunfire tore through the compound, grenades shook the earth, and screams filled the night. But above it all, Lena's wrath reigned. She was their angel of death, cutting down threats before they even knew they were targets. A machine gun crew tried to set up on the roof. Her bullet pierced the gunner's skull, sending the heavy weapon toppling uselessly. A commander barked orders from the courtyard. Her shot tore his chest apart midward. The insurgents fought, but panic spread like fire. They were being hunted by an invisible predator, and every second another one of them fell. The SEALs pushed deeper, planting charges on ammo stores, rigging fuel depots to ignite. Fire bloomed across the compound, towers collapsing, walls crumbling. When the last blew, the fortress became an inferno, smoke and flame painting the night sky. Mason called for extraction, his voice steady but his chest tight with something more than relief. They had done the impossible, taken down a fortress with a skeleton crew and a borrowed sniper. And at the center of it all was her. When the dust settled and the team regrouped outside the ruins, Lena stood apart, the rifle hanging loose in her hands. Her expression was unreadable, her breathing even, but the fire reflected in her eyes like old memories rekindled. The SEALs gathered around her, silent, waiting. It was Reyes who finally spoke, his voice rough but tinged with awe. "She doesn't just shoot," he said. "She breaks them." The men nodded, the weight of his words undeniable. Mason's gaze lingered on her, steady and certain. "We'll remember her wrath," he said again, and this time, every man repeated, their voices low and unshaken, like a vow carved into stone. The roar of flames still echoed in their ears long after the fortress collapsed into itself. The team moved out under the cover of night, their silhouettes swallowed by the desert, the stars watching silently above. The extraction would not arrive for another 48 hours, which meant they had to survive on what little water, ammunition, and grit remained. Each man carried the fatigue of battle in his bones, yet they walked with a strange lightness too, the weight of victory steadying their steps. And always at their center was Lena, her rifle across her back, her gaze scanning the horizon with that unflinching focus that had become their anchor. None of them said it out loud, but every man knew they would not be alive without her. By dawn they found a pocket of ruins, half buried by sand, walls of mud and stone crumbling with age. It offered cover, a place to rest, but Mason was cautious. He set sentries, rotated watches, and rationed what remained of their food. The men collapsed into brief, dreamless sleep, but Mason found himself awake, eyes on Lena as she sat alone with her rifle across her knees. She hadn't closed her eyes once. He approached quietly, lowering himself onto the stone beside her. "You'll burn yourself out if you keep this up," he said. She didn't look at him. Burning out keeps them alive. Mason studied her profile, the sharpness of her features hardened by the dawn. "You carry too much," he said. She gave a faint, bitter smile. "I carry what I've earned." And then, softer, almost like a confession, "Every shot I take now balances one I couldn't take before." Mason didn't ask more. He didn't need to. Her past was written in the way she breathed, the way she moved, the scars. He told her something else. "The men trust you. More than they've trusted anyone in a long time." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, fragile, almost disbelieving, before she smothered it. "They trust survival," she said. But Mason shook his head. "No. They trust you." It was a simple truth, and he left it there, letting the silence take it. That night, trouble found them. Insurgent scouts, drawn by the smoke of the destroyed fortress, swept the desert in pickup trucks mounted with machine guns. The ruins offered shelter but also risk. If they were found, it would be a siege they could not win. The SEALs prepared quietly, weapons checked, positions taken, hearts steady. Lena crawled to the edge of a crumbled wall, scope raised. Through the glass she saw them. 3 trucks, headlights cutting across the sand, men armed to the teeth scanning the darkness. She exhaled, the world narrowing to her tunnel of vision. The first shot shattered a headlight, plunging one truck into blind darkness. Shouts erupted, brakes screeched, but before confusion turned into fire, her second bullet dropped the gunner reaching for the mounted weapon. The ruins erupted in chaos. Gunfire tore the silence apart, tracer rounds streaking red through the night. The SEALs fired with disciplined bursts, striking hard and fast, but it was Lena who turned the tide. Every time an insurgent leaned from a truck window, she put them down. Every time a gunner tried to man a machine gun, her bullet arrived first. Her wrath was merciless, precise, the cold answer to their aggression. The trucks spun in circles, colliding in panic, men screaming as they fell into the sand. The firefight lasted minutes, but to the men it felt like hours. When silence finally returned, 3 trucks burned in the distance, bodies scattered across the desert floor, and the SEALs remained unscathed. Reyes let out a sharp laugh, half relief, half disbelief. "We're walking out of hell because she's dragging us by the teeth," he muttered. One of the others clapped Lena on the shoulder as they regrouped, his eyes wide with something that bordered on awe. Lena, as always, said nothing. She only cleaned the rifle, her hands steady, her face unreadable. But Mason caught the way her shoulders trembled, not from fear, but from the relentless weight she carried. He said nothing, only passed her a canteen of water and met her gaze. In his eyes she found something she hadn't in years, not pity, not doubt, but respect, solid and unyielding. The next day their radios crackled to life with fragments of bad news. Their fortress had been a stronghold, and its destruction had rattled the hornet's nest. Dozens of fighters were converging across the region, searching for the ghosts who had reduced their might to rubble. Mason gathered the men, voice low and steady. "We've got 48 hours until extraction. They'll hunt us until then. Our only chance is to keep moving, stay hidden, and fight only when we must." He looked at Lena last. She didn't wait for him to say it. "I'll keep them blind." That night, exhaustion finally caught up to the men. They slept in turns, weapons in hand, dreams fractured by the echoes of gunfire. Lena stayed awake as always, the stars mirrored in her scope, her body a still shadow against the ruins. She Each man had come to rely on her without saying it, without needing to. Their lives flowed through her scope, through her breath, through her trigger finger. Mason lay awake longer than the others, listening to the silence, feeling the tension hum in his bones. He looked at Lena, framed against the night, and realized she had become more than their savior. She had become their certainty, their shield, the wrath they wielded against an enemy that outnumbered them 10 to 1. And in that realization came something heavier than trust: dependence. They were bound to her now, their survival tied to her past, her skill, her merciless calm. Mason closed his eyes, letting fatigue drag him under, but the last thought in his mind echoed with the same words he'd spoken before, words that now felt less like praise and more like prophecy. We'll remember her. Hours bled into one another beneath the endless sky, and every step felt the same as the last, but danger lurked in every horizon. For the SEALs, the march to extraction was less a journey and more a test of will. Sand crusted their lips, sweat stung their eyes, and the ache in their muscles gnawed deeper with every mile. Yet they pushed on, silent, disciplined, each man knowing that stopping meant death. And at their center, Lena moved like a shadow bound to them. She never faltered, never slowed. Her eyes stayed sharp, her rifle never left her reach. If fatigue dragged her down, she hid it beneath the steel of her composure. To the men, she had become something more than human, unyielding, unbreakable, and deadly in ways that made them question how they'd ever doubted her. On the third night, as they skirted the edge of a dry riverbed, trouble came again. First, then swelling like thunder. Mason signaled a halt, hand raised. The men dropped into the sand, rifles aimed at the darkness. Through the scope, Lena saw them before anyone else. 2 trucks, headlights off, silhouettes crawling along the riverbed. She scanned further. More shadows moved behind them, figures on foot fanning out like predators closing a trap. It wasn't a patrol. It was a hunt. The insurgents knew they were here. Mason slid beside her, whisper sharp. How many? Lena's voice was steady. At least 30. Maybe more. The words carried no fear, but the men stiffened. 30 against 7 was suicide. But Lena's next words cut through their doubt. We don't fight them head on. We break them apart. She shifted her scope, finger grazing the trigger. Watch. The first the lead driver. His truck veered sideways, slamming into the riverbank with a crash that split the night. Shouts erupted, men scattering in confusion. Before they regrouped, her second shot punched through a gunner climbing into position. Then another, silencing a commander waving his arms. Chaos spread through their lines, and in the confusion Mason barked orders. Shift right, keep moving. The SEALs ghosted along the river's edge, slipping between dunes while Lena's wrath carved disorder behind them. The insurgents fired wildly into the night, bullets shredding sand, but they never found their mark. Every time one tried to organize, Lena's bullet found him first. The running battle stretched into the night, the SEALs using terrain as their shield while Lena dictated the rhythm of survival. Her scope tracked faster than Mason thought possible, each kill deliberate. By dawn, the survivors retreated, dragging their wounded, their hunt shattered into chaos. The SEALs collapsed behind a ridge, chest heaving, sweat streaking through dust. Reyes spat into the sand, shaking his head. 30 men chasing us and we're still standing. That's not luck. He looked at Lena, his grin fierce. That's her wrath. But victory came with a price. Ammunition was running dangerously low. Their food was gone, water nearly spent. The men were bones wrapped in grit and muscle, and the weight of survival pressed heavier each hour. Mason counted their magazines, barely. Enough for another firefight. He knew extraction was still a day away, maybe longer if command faced delays. And if the enemy regrouped before then, their chances shrank to nothing. He gathered the men in the shadow of a dune. And every bullet count. One more push and we're home. The men nodded, weary but resolute. Their eyes turned to Lena, waiting. She chambered another round, her silence its own promise. She would keep them alive. That night, the desert was too quiet. No engines, no voices, only the whisper of wind. Mason didn't like it. He paced the perimeter while the men rested in shifts. Lena stayed prone at the ridge, her scope sweeping across the black expanse. Hours passed without movement, but then she saw it. A flicker of metal, moonlight catching on steel. Her breath stilled. Through the scope, she traced the faint outlines of men crawling low across the sand, insurgents moving on foot, trying to close silently. She counted them. 20, maybe more. Patient, disciplined. Dark. She didn't wait. Her first shot shattered the silence, dropping the point man where he lay. Mason jolted awake, his instincts snapping sharp. The men scrambled, rifles raised, while shouts erupted across the sand. The insurgents charged, opening fire, bullets sparking off stone and whipping through the air. The SEALs answered with disciplined bursts, but their ammunition dwindled fast. Lena became the center of the storm, her wrath unrelenting. Each squeeze of the trigger dropped another attacker, her scope cutting through dust and muzzle flash as though the night itself bent to her will. A man leapt behind a dune, rocket launcher on his shoulder. Her bullet pierced his skull before his finger pressed the trigger. Another crawled within yards of Reyes, knife drawn. Lena's shot split his spine, saving him in the final second. The seals were burning through their last magazines. Mason shouted over the chaos, his voice iron. "Hold the line. Extraction's coming." But in truth he didn't know if it was. They were fighting on hope and Lena's scope, nothing more. Minutes stretched like hours, the ground shaking with the force of their survival. And then, silence. The last insurgent fell into the sand, body limp, blood dark against the moonlit dunes. The SEALs panted in the aftermath, rifles nearly empty, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. Lena lowered the rifle slowly, her face unreadable, her hands steady despite the storm she had unleashed. Mason moved to her, kneeling in the sand beside her. His voice was low, rough from smoke and shouting. "You kept us alive again." She didn't answer. She only looked past him, into the horizon where the first faint glow of dawn touched the edge of the world. Her eyes were hard, but inside them burned something fierce, something the men had come to know well. Wrath, quiet and unrelenting, the kind that didn't fade when the battle ended. The SEALs sat in silence, each of them knowing the truth without needing to speak it. They were alive because of her. And if the enemy came again, if the desert demanded another fight before extraction, they would live only as long as she kept her rifle steady. Reyes broke the silence, his voice low but certain. "We'll remember her wrath." The dawn came pale and merciless, stretching its light across dunes still scarred by the night's battle. Smoke curled from the bodies left in the sand, vultures already circling high above. The SEALs were down to scraps of ammunition and half a canteen of water between them, but they were alive, and survival in this wasteland meant defiance. Mason ordered them to the battlefield. The enemy would return, drawn by silence where their men had vanished. Each man lifted his pack, bodies aching, faces grim, and they pressed forward into the horizon. Lena brought up the rear, rifle slung, eyes cutting across the desert with the calm of someone who saw further than anyone else. By midday the heat was unbearable. The sun hammered down, turning the sand into a furnace that burned through their boots. The men staggered, lips cracked, their pace faltering. Reyes stumbled to his knees at one point, muttering curses through parched lips. Lena was the one who lifted him, slipping her shoulder beneath his weight, guiding him forward without breaking stride. The others saw it and carried on, no words exchanged because words meant wasting breath. They marched on instinct, their faith not in command, not in who moved upon them like a shadow. When the sun sank and the desert chilled, they reached a cluster of jagged rocks jutting from the dunes. It wasn't much, but it offered cover, a place to collapse and breathe. Mason ordered a halt, and the men slumped against stone, half dead from exhaustion. Lena didn't sit. She crawled to the highest ridge, settled behind her scope, and scanned the endless horizon. Mason watched her silhouette against the stars, that same tireless vigilance, and felt the knot in his chest tighten. He walked up quietly, crouched beside her. "You'll run yourself into the ground." She didn't glance at him. "I can't stop." Mason studied her face, hard lines carved by resolve, and asked what he had been carrying for days. "Who taught you?" Her silence stretched long, but then she spoke, voice low, words like stones dragged from deep water. "My father. He was a soldier in a war no one remembers. When I was a girl he told me the rifle doesn't lie. You breathe with it, you see with it, you kill with it. When he died I carried that truth. And I kept carrying it, through every war that followed." Mason's throat tightened, but she wasn't finished. Her eyes remained on the glass. "I tried to bury it. I wanted to forget. But when you asked who would cover you I couldn't stay silent. I was born back into it." Mason didn't press further. He only nodded, his respect growing heavier with every word she let slip. When he returned to the others he didn't tell them what she said. Some truths belonged to the one who carried them. That night the desert wasn't silent. A low rumble rose in the distance, the faint thunder of vehicles. The SEALs tensed, rifles raised, hearts pounding. Lena pressed her eye to the scope, scanning. Saw me for blood unfold. Not trucks. Not scouts. A convoy, bigger than the first two, maybe 50 men sweeping the dunes in formation. They were hunting and they were closing in. Lena's jaw tightened. She whispered the count to Mason, her voice a razor in the dark. 50. Maybe more. The men stared silent. They had barely enough ammunition to fend off 10. 50 meant certain death. Mason clenched his jaw, the weight of command pressing like iron. We hold them until extraction, he said finally. His men didn't argue. They looked at Lena instead, waiting for her to decide what survival could mean. She lowered the scope, her face carved from stone. Then we make them bleed for every step. The convoy reached them before dawn. Engines roared, headlights cut across the rocks, voices shouted in foreign tongues. The SEALs braced in their positions, hidden among stone and sand, weapons ready. Lena lay prone, scope glinting faintly her body. Still as death. The first truck crested the ridge, and her bullet shattered the windshield, killing the driver instantly. The vehicle swerved, slamming into the one behind it. Chaos ignited. Shouts, gunfire, the desert erupting in violence. The SEALs fired in controlled bursts, cutting down men who stumbled in confusion, but it was Lena's wrath that kept them alive. Every time the enemy regrouped, she broke them. Every time a machine gun spun toward her men, she dropped the gunner with unerring precision. But the enemy was relentless. For every man who fell, 2 more surged forward, bullets tearing the rocks into dust. Reyes screamed as a round grazed his arm, blood soaking his sleeve. Another SEAL went down, not dead but pinned, sand exploding. It was Lena's voice, sharp and cutting, that steadied them. Left flank, 2 men now. Her shot killed one, Mason's rifle dropped the other. The team moved like extensions of her vision, her scope guiding their survival. The battle stretched into eternity. Magazines emptied, grenades dwindled, the SEALs running on fumes and fury. Yet Lena never slowed. She shifted from target to target, her breathing steady, her aim unbroken. When an insurgent tried to flank them with a rocket, her bullet pierced his chest before he pulled the trigger. When 3 men rushed a fallen SEAL, she cut them down in 3 clean shots, her hands as unshaken as if she were sculpting fate itself. At last, as dawn bled across the horizon, the enemy broke. Survivors fled into the dunes, dragging their wounded, leaving behind smoking vehicles and dust. The ragged breathing of the SEALs. They had survived the impossible again. The men slumped against the rocks, weapons empty, bodies trembling. Mason staggered toward Lena, who still lay prone, her rifle smoking in the cool air. He crouched beside her, voice hoarse. You carried us through hell. Lena finally lifted her head, her eyes ringed with exhaustion, but her hands still steady. No, she said softly. We carried each other. I just pulled the trigger. The men gathered around her, silent, the truth pressing heavier than words. They knew they had survived not because of numbers, not because of luck, but because of her wrath. Reyes spoke what they were all thinking, his voice rough and certain. If the world forgets us, fine. But it'll never forget her. And in the burning silence of the desert, the vow returned again. Like prayer forged in fire and blood. We'll remember her wrath. The desert stank of blood and burning fuel long after the last echoes of gunfire faded. The SEALs were wrecked, drained beyond measure, but they clung to life with the stubbornness only warriors could muster. Lena sat apart from them, rifle resting across her knees, eyes locked on the horizon as though the sands themselves held secrets only she could read. Mason wanted to let her rest, to tell her she had done enough, but he knew better. She was the only reason they were still breathing, and she was far from done. The men patched wounds with strips of cloth, drank the last drops of their water, and loaded the few bullets they had left. None complained, none faltered. They had stopped being a team of men led by rank. They had become disciples to a truth forged in fire, that survival lay in following the vision of the sniper who never missed. Even the youngest of them, barely 23 and bleeding from shrapnel in his leg, whispered to Reyes that if Lena ordered him to charge the gates of hell, he'd go smiling. As the sun rose higher, Mason pulled out the battered radio. Static hissed, but at last a voice cracked through, faint, distorted, but real. The extraction bird had been delayed, pinned by storms and enemy patrols, but it was coming. 30 hours, maybe less. 30 hours of survival in a wasteland where 50 men had just died without breaking them. Mason relayed the news to his men, and the response wasn't despair, it was resolve. They'd done the impossible twice already. They could last 30 more hours if Lena led the way. By midday they moved again. The convoy wreckage smoldered behind them, a beacon that would draw reinforcements. They pressed deeper into the dunes, using jagged ridges and shallow gullies for cover. The SEALs trusted her instincts more than their maps. When she paused, they froze. When she advanced, they followed. It was as though the desert itself bent to her will, guiding them away from death's shadow. As night fell, hunger clawed at their bellies. The men chewed dry roots Mason had found half buried in sand, bitter and barely edible, but enough to keep them from collapsing. Lena didn't eat. She sat with her rifle trained on the stars, lips pressed tight, her face unreadable. Reyes approached her, arm bandaged, his usual smirk gone. "You ever think you'd be the one saving SEALs instead of the other way around?" She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked toward him, and for the first time in days, he thought he saw the ghost of a smile. But every time it was away in their minds, knowing the night sky hid enemies. Twice she fired into the dark, and twice the thud of a body hitting sand followed. No one asked how she saw them. They didn't need to know. By dawn their numbers were thinner. One man's fever worsened, another slipped into unconsciousness. Yet morale didn't shatter. It bent, stretched, but didn't break because they all carried the same thought: if they could just hold out, she would see them through. The sun climbed, blistering, merciless, and still they marched, moving like shadows across the endless sea of dunes. But by midday fate tested them again. A drone's faint buzz broke the silence. The men froze, eyes snapping to the sky. The small black shape circled high above, too high to hit, too clear to mistake. "We've been spotted," Mason muttered. Where there was a drone, there would be boots on the sand soon after. The men readied what was left of their gear, and Lena adjusted her scope, already tracking its path. She couldn't kill the drone, but she could prepare for the storm that would follow. The storm came at sunset. Trucks rolled across the dunes, headlights cutting through the gloom. Not 50 this time, more. An entire company, maybe 80 men, fanning out with ruthless precision. The SEALs knew what it meant: annihilation. Their rifles clattered with near-empty magazines. They had grenades, knives, and sheer willpower, nothing more. And yet, when Lena lay down on the ridge, breathing slow, her cheek pressed against the rifle stock, the men's terror shifted into defiance. If this was to be their last stand, they'd fight under her shadow. The first wave charged, bullets stitching the sand, and Lena's rifle cracked. Over. The men answered with their own fire, sharp bursts, controlled, every bullet counting. But for every enemy who fell, more came. Mason shouted orders until his throat was raw. Reyes dragged the wounded behind rocks, and still Lena's wrath poured forth like steel rain. She moved with a predator's calm, eyes unblinking, hands steady, as if every enemy who stepped into her scope had already been sentenced. An RPG streaked toward their position. The explosion rocked the ridge, flinging dust and stone into the air. Mason felt his ears ring, blood streaming down his face, but even through the chaos he heard her rifle again. She had dropped the Rocketeer in the second before the blast. Another wave came, men screaming, firing blindly, trying to overwhelm through sheer numbers. The SEALs fought like wolves, blades flashing when bullets ran dry. Lena was unshaken. She shifted position, sand spraying beneath her boots, eyes never leaving the scope. Men fell in heaps, screaming, silenced. Her wrath didn't burn hot, it burned cold, precise, merciless. The enemy faltered, slowed, then broke against them like waves on stone. When the last truck retreated into the darkness, engines roaring in panic, silence fell once more. The ridge was a graveyard, bodies littered across the sand, smoke twisting in the night air. The SEALs were half dead, bleeding, shaking, but alive. And as they gathered around Lena, exhaustion etched in every line of their faces, they knew they had crossed a line no soldier forgets. Reyes leaned against a rock, breathing hard, staring at her with something close to awe. "If this is your wrath," he said quietly, "I pray I never see the full measure of it." No one laughed. They only nodded, the vow burning deeper into their hearts. "We'll remember her wrath." The night dragged on, long and merciless. The SEALs held their ground on the ridge, surrounded by silence too heavy to trust. They had fought off waves before, but this time it had taken every shred of their strength. Blood soaked into the sand, their bodies ached with wounds that had no proper bandages, and yet not a single man dared suggest they couldn't last until morning. Not while Lena still crouched at the edge of the ridge, her rifle steady, her eyes alive with that fire that refused to die. The radio crackled faintly as Mason tried again. Static swallowed his voice, but then, just as the men began to lose hope, a miracle broke through. a clear response, sharp and urgent. Extraction was inbound. A Black Hawk was coming. Let's turn to the team, his voice ragged but certain. We just have to hold until the bird arrives. 1 more hour. That's all. 1 hour felt like an eternity when you had nothing left to give. The men checked their weapons, knowing every chamber was nearly dry. Reyes pulled 2 grenades from his vest and kissed one like it was holy. Another SEAL tightened a blood-soaked bandage around his thigh and laughed bitterly. They were shadows of the warriors who'd entered this desert, but their spirits were sharper than ever. And at the center of it stood Lena, not a soldier by title, but the embodiment of everything they'd been trained to be. The buzz came first, distant engines growing louder, rolling across the dunes like thunder. Enemy reinforcements, desperate to finish what they'd started before the extraction bird arrived. Headlights flashed again on the horizon. Dozens of stand like Mason's chest sank. They had 1 hour to survive against an army. He looked at Lena and she was already prone, scope gleaming under the moonlight. She had no fear. She was already at war. The trucks surged closer, engines snarling, weapons flashing as they fired into the night. The SEALs opened up with what little they had, each round chosen carefully, each trigger pull meant to buy 1 more breath of life. And Lena became something unearthly. Her shots cracked like the voice of fate, every bullet finding a throat, a skull, a driver's chest. Vehicles swerved, rolled, caught fire. Men screamed and tumbled from their mounts, never even seeing where death had come from. Reyes was hit, a grazing wound across his shoulder, but he didn't stop firing. Another man went down, crawling to a better position with gritted teeth, refusing to quit. Mason fought with a fury he didn't know he had, every command ripped from his lungs like fire. Yet it was Lena who anchored them. Calm, cold, precise, unbreakable. She was no longer just a sniper. She was the storm itself, and the enemy broke against her again and again. Minutes blurred into chaos. The ridge was alive with fire and smoke, bullets kicking up sand inches from their heads. 1 grenade from the enemy rolled dangerously close, and without hesitation Lena kicked it back down the slope. The explosion lit the night, scattering bodies like ragdolls. Mason saw her silhouetted in the firelight, and for a moment she looked less like a woman and more like a spirit of vengeance that had taken flesh. And then it came, the deep, thunderous chop of helicopter blades. The Black Hawk broke over the horizon like salvation itself, searchlights cutting through the haze. The SEALs roared with relief, but the enemy doubled down, desperate to wipe them out before rescue could land. RPGs streaked skyward, tracer rounds filling the dark. The Black Hawk fired back, side guns tearing through the lines, but it still couldn't land while fire raged so close. It was up to the SEALs to hold a clearing long enough for extraction. Push them back. Mason bellowed, voice breaking. The team surged forward in one last desperate stand, knives, fists, and bayonets when bullets ran dry. Lena covered them, dropping enemy after enemy until her last magazine clicked empty. Without pause, she drew a sidearm, firing calmly into the chaos, each shot just as lethal as the rifles. Reyes stumbled beside her, bloody but laughing like a madman, shouting, "We're almost there. Hold it, damn it, hold it." The final wave faltered under the combined assault. Trucks burned into the dunes, their courage shattered by the sniper who refused to miss. The Black Hawk swooped lower, its guns clearing the last pockets of resistance. Mason signaled the extraction, and the bird hovered just long enough for the SEALs to scramble aboard. They hauled each other in, broken, battered, but breathing. Lena was the last up, Reyes yanking her arm as the bird rose into the night sky. Inside the helicopter, silence reigned at first. The SEALs collapsed against the steel walls, chest heaving, too drained to speak. Mason leaned back, closing his eyes, the roar of the rotors drowning his thoughts. Then slowly Reyes began to laugh, a raw, breathless sound that spread until even the wounded joined in. Relief, disbelief, triumph. They had done the impossible. They had survived. Lena sat in the corner, rifle across her lap, staring out the open hatch at the burning desert below. Her face was calm, unreadable, as though nothing had happened. Mason watched her for a long moment before finally speaking, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We'll remember your wrath," he said. And the others, every single one of them, echoed it like a prayer. The Black Hawk vanished into the horizon, carrying them toward safety, leaving behind a battlefield littered with the proof of her wrath. And though the desert would cover the blood and ash in time, the memory of that night, the sniper who rose when they needed her most, would never be buried. The end.